Today I want to talk about an important concept in Flesh and Blood that I'm going to call power over time. And this is the average hand strength of decks throughout the game. This can be pretty easily described through looking at Syndra's power graph over time. Now, this is pretty crude, but in my opinion, Syndra is a deck that has a pretty stable power level over time. The amount of damage that she's going to deal every single turn is stable. She's going to go 3, 3, 4, 3, or 3, 3, 4, 5. But the amount of damage that she deals in between, like those two different hands, isn't going to change unless you're giving her mass triggers or stuff like that. So really, she has a very flat power over time graph. And then right at the end here, she suddenly runs out of cards and immediately dies. Syndra's power over time graph can be directly compared to Jarl's power over time. Jarl's a guardian who is playing a pretty slow game that involves decomposing, and so you gain some power over time by decomposing. And then he also at some point reaches his pitch stack, and when he reaches his pitch stack, his hands get fundamentally much stronger because he gets to fuse Oakenolds with cards that he can get out of a hand like Fruits of the Forest, and he's set up for the end game where eventually he is going to use the value on his weapon and on his stronger pitch stack to kill you. And then we have Zen's power over time graph, which is a much more complicated graph. Zen's power comes from drawing and creating chi, and at the start of the game, he has 0 chi in deck, but he can get spike turns when he draws the chi. But as he creates more and more chi, he gets more and more powerful over time. And then suddenly he's playing Chase the Tails, he's playing Mauling Cheese, and he's getting really powerful into the mid game. But then he starts running out of combo cards. He has to play some weaker combo cards until the end game. But then in the end game, his deck suddenly becomes all chi and Cosmic Awakenings, and he just deals 20 damage in a hand, and then he runs out of cards entirely. And he still has a little bit of power because he is allowed to, if he keeps Shuka around, go 2-1-1 with his Tigers, but mostly he loses all of his power after he either attacks or blocks with his Cosmic Awakenings. So this is Zen's power over time graph. Now, why are these power over time graphs important? Well, you should take into account your opponent's power over time because it can inform your blocking and attacking decisions. Like, let's take Zen for example, because I think a variable power over time graph is something that you can easily play around. Early in the game is when Zen is at his least powerful. He has no chi in deck, and he has to draw and play chi in order to have powerful turns. What that means is if the Zen doesn't flip a chi and isn't able to have a powerful turn, you might want to be taking that damage in order to send a more powerful turn. Especially because the moment Zen draws chi, he's going to try to not block as much as possible because he wants to play some crazy Chase the Tail line or Mauling Chi line. But then, as he gets to the peak of his power in the mid game, you may want to consider, arsling a defense reaction somewhere right before he gets to his most powerful moments so that you're able to block effectively on his more powerful turns. And then as he becomes less powerful, as he runs out of combo cards in his deck, you might want to take into account how many combo cards are in his graveyard, try to guess how many more he has, see how many more powerful turns he has. And when you see that he's becoming less powerful, you start bringing back your aggression and try to fight for control of the game. And then when he reaches the Cosmic Awakening stage, you have to realize, oh, if I don't kill him now, I'm going to get hit for 20 damage. And so you start taking, small chip in order to try and push for lethal, because if you don't, you're going to die. But, you can check to see if all his Cosmic Awakenings are gone. And if that's the case, then yeah, maybe you can just kind of block out and play a mid-range game and try and kill him. This is an analysis you can do for every single deck in the game, but let's discuss it for the other decks that I made graphs about. When you look at Syndra's power over time graph, it's pretty clear that there's really only 2 ways you're ever going to beat Syndra. You're either going to have an average power level above Syndra, right? So if the power of your turn is going to be more than the power of Syndra's turn, you play it. And if the power is going to be less, then you block mask. And then eventually you either deal more damage than she does, or you fatigue her completely. And not every deck can fatigue her completely, and it's actually pretty hard to do through Flick Knives, but there are some decks that can do it. Or you need to be dealing more damage than her average damage per turn, which will usually involve blocking mass, because if she gets a mass trigger, then she is going to be dealing more damage than you. And, looking at this graph, I put it as a straight line to just show the average power level, but, it probably looks something more like a up and down jagged line, pretty small here. Like some turns she's getting 2 more value, some turns she's getting like 1 less or 2 less value because she has to pitch to a dagger. But overall, the average of her turn is pretty constant, and you can kind of tell that, averaging the cards in her hand is going to be something around 4-ish damage for each card, and so you act accordingly. And then for Jarl, his power goes up over time, so we want to make sure that we are getting in enough damage before he reaches pitch stack. If he reaches pitch stack and is able to play fused Oakenolds and do all of the powerful plays he wants to do, like CNC Pummel, then you're just going to lose the game eventually to his value. So you need to be playing turns in the early and mid game in order to make sure that he doesn't do that. Now, the other side of this coin is that when you're playing those decks, right, if you're playing Jarl, you need to know, when I get to the late game, I'm going to have a powerful pitch stack that is going to let me kill my opponent, right? I've pitched an Oakenold in the early game next to an Ice and an Earth card. So we want to make sure that we slow down the early and mid game, which is why cards like Channel like Frigid, Blizzard, your D-Reacts, all those cards are really strong in the deck, because you're getting to an end game state where your opponent isn't doing as many strong things and you're doing really strong things. When we look at the Zen power graph, when you're playing Zen, the reason why we play so many D-Reacts in the deck is that we want to make sure we're getting as much power out of this first phase of the game as possible. And on offense, your cards are worth basically nothing unless you're getting Tigers and activating Chi, right? So if instead of having these 3-block reds that we can't really attack with, we have these 4 and 5-block defense reactions, well, we're gaining a lot of value instead of just, playing a 4-card 6, right? And then when we reach the mid game, we want to be looking to see, how many D-Reacts do I have in the yard? Am I going to be drawing more Chi than not, right? We want to see how many Chase the Tails we have to try and play around what our opponent is doing and how much damage we're doing. Like, what are we arsenaling, stuff like that. Like, do I want to be arsenaling defense reactions in this situation in order to play around like cards like Snatch and stuff, or do I want to not be arsenaling at all in order to play around cards like CNC because I know that I'm going to be drawing these powerful Chi that I'm just going to be playing anyways, right? Do I need to save my armor for the weakest link on hit or amnesia on hit because I need to make sure that I'm having powerful turns in the mid game, right? There's a lot of different decisions to be made in this circumstance, right? And then we get to the end game, and in matchups where Cosmic Awakening matters, we want to make sure we have enough life in order to actually have this really strong power spike in the end game. And deal 20 damage with 4 cards. Then with Syndra, maybe you're playing against a deck that is threatening to fatigue you over time. They have life gain and stuff to make it so that your Flick Knives matters less. And in those matchups, maybe, you're pitching to daggers more to try and get in a little chip damage. Maybe you're playing some blue so that in the end game, you can dagger loop your opponent with 5 pings a turn, stuff like that, in order to make sure that this drop-off isn't quite as steep as it would be if, you had only reds in the deck. You also want to know the exact output of your turn and the exact output of your opponent's turn, right? Syndra in the mid game against Zen maybe is less willing to block because she knows the Zen is going to be less willing to block, both because they'll be drawing more Chi, but also because they're going to be wanting to keep more cards in order to play powerful Chi turns. Now, how can you determine like these power over time graphs for yourself? Well, you want to look at the deck list to see like, what is my opponent doing? So let's look at some deck lists to try and figure out these power over time graphs for ourselves. This is Majin Bay's first place deck list from Battlehardened Portland. Playing Verdance. Verdance is a hero that decomposes, and when she has 8 Earth cards in her Banishown, Whenever she gains a life during her turn, she can deal an arcane damage. So when we look at her cards, well, she has a bunch of different power cards, right? Felling of the Crown, Channel Millennium Tree, Ring of Roses, and then she also has the healing potions. So one thing we can look at here is knowing, okay, Verdance has this combo game plan. Um, Sometimes she plays healing potions plus Surge and Aether Tide and Rampant Growth, right? So what she does is she plays some healing cards, right, like Sigil of Solace to gain life, and then plays Rampant Growth to amp X, where X is the total amount of life you've gained that turn, and then you pitch 2 into Aether Tide, which deals 1 plus the rampant growth damage, right? And then Surge and Aether Tide pushes the damage it deals to the next spell, and then plays some spell. She has this growth of power over time where she, in the end game, has a huge spike in power because she can play these healing potions to just gain 2 life on board in order to have a huge combo. But also, she gains power over time because of the decompose effects that she has, not only from her hero power, but also cards like Felling of the Crown, right? So in the on the first turns of the game, she's actually fairly weak because she doesn't have any earth cards in her banish zone, so a lot of her cards just kind of don't do anything, right? Rootbound Carapace is just a 0 for 3 defense reaction at red. Felling of the Crown sometimes it's just like a 2-card 4, right? And so she needs to block with these cards to get them into the graveyard. But then in the mid game, she gets significantly stronger because her Felling of the Crown becomes a 2-card 8 that puts a card from your hand on the bottom of the deck, right? So she just gains a ton of power over time. And just by looking at the deck list and kind of playing a couple matches against her, you can figure out, okay, she is a deck that is weak at the beginning and then gets very strong in the end game. So if you're playing Verdance, you want to make sure that you're blocking with cards in the beginning because your cards suck, right? And then in the mid and late game, you can start playing your cards because they get better over time. And then you also want to make sure that if you need to play to a combo game plan, you're doing so. We can also look at a Kano deck list to try and figure out, what's the power over time look like for this hero? Well, the hero power doesn't tell you too much, but there are some cards in the deck that kind of tell you some stuff, right? They play Potion of Deja Vu, which says destroy it, put all cards from your pitch zone on top of your deck in any order. They're playing Energy Potion. They're attempting to resolve these potions in order to create a strong mid-game combo push. And then, so what that means is that they start fairly weak. They're basically doing 0 damage. And then in the mid-game, they go Insano mode. They go infinite. They're dealing 1,000,000 damage. But if you survive that 1,000,000 damage, then when you get into the end game, Kano actually gets significantly weaker because he just doesn't have the amount of damage that his opponents do, and he has to just get a little bit of chip in over time in order to try and kill his opponents, especially after he uses his equipment like Stormstriders, Spellfire Cloak to gain a resource, Ragamuffin's Hat in order to guarantee a hit off of Kano, stuff like that. And so he doesn't have the same late game power that maybe some other decks do, and he doesn't have the early game power that some decks do, but he's trading all of that for an insane combo in the mid game with these potions. And then I also want to talk about Aelia. This is the Sandscour Great Bow New Horizon Aelia that Justin Salmon got third with at Battle Hardened Portland. This deck list is somewhat unique in that it actually has more power troughs over time, right? The deck will accumulate resources on one turn and then utilize those resources in order to gain strong advantage. That gives her the space in order to accumulate more resources again. And, there's some cards in the deck that kind of cheat that, like Heatseeker and Premeditate. But oftentimes the deck is taking on turns and off turns in order to set up, strong 6-card hands. The way we can tell this is with the card New Horizons, which says while you have a face-up card in your arsenal, you have an additional arsenal zone. So what that means is that, if Aelia goes first, she's able to load an arrow either from the top of her deck or from her hand with Sandscour Great Bow. And then she can put another card into her arsenal at the end of her turn and then set up for her second turn with a 6-card hand. And that 6-card hand might be able to utilize opt effects like Raid the Glide Path or other things like that in order to gain advantage and deal a bunch of damage on that turn. And then maybe she has to take an off turn in order to set up her arsenal again to play another really strong dominated turn. And so when you're playing this Aelia list, you want to make sure that you're playing into those powerful turns and the not so powerful turns. And cards like Favor Scene allow you to play better into the defensive turns, and Heatseeker and Premeditate allow you to play more into the powerful turns in order to keep your power going. This deck really rewards you for knowing when you should utilize the card that's in your second arsenal and when you should keep it there. When you're playing against this Aelia deck, you might want to Arsenal Command and Conquer for a turn when you know that the Aelia is going to be going for that double Arsenal play, so that you can try and prevent them from having a really powerful turn on the next turn that they're able to play. I hope this video was helpful to you. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions about this concept of power over time and how it affects your play and deck building.